The following interview was recorded on May 9th, 2023. It has been edited and produced for your listening and viewing enjoyment. Welcome into another episode of the Briar Chat podcast. I'm Cam Huffman, Director of Public Relations here at the Greenbrier, and I'm joined by a guest that most of you probably know well, Dr. Bob Conte, our historian emeritus. And Dr. Bob's been on the show with us a couple times, but there's so much history to cover. He's going to be on there a few more times.
Okay.
There's a whole lot to cover when it comes to history here at America's Resort. Nearly 250 years of history, in fact. And today's topic that we're going to talk about is the Greenbrier's role during World War II. But before we get to that, I want to mention we're in the spring room today. And that's one of my favorite things about this podcast is we're always filming in a different location and bringing people different rooms of the Greenbrier. And this is an interesting one here, and it's got that sort of that classic Dorothy Draper look with the rose.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
It's a unique room, and I know there's a story about the fountains behind us as well, right, Dr. Bob?
Yeah, people all the time say, oh, isn't that a nice soda fountain you have there? It's not a soda fountain. At one time, this particular room was built in 1930. They used to pump the sulfur water in here. And that's a custom that goes back to the old European resorts where they pump the water, the mineral water, into the hotel, and so you can drink it right from the spring, or you can drink it right from here. So you would go up to the counter and get a shot of sulfur water, and that's part of that whole. That's what the Greenbrier is about. That's why there is the Greenbrier. We came here to restore your health through the sulfur water.
Well, speaking of restoring your health, that's going to get us into our topic today: the Greenbrier's role during World War II. And as a lot of people know, some people don't know, the Greenbrier actually served as an Army hospital during that time. But even before that, the Greenbrier had another role in the war as well, didn't it?
Right. Two things happened here during the Second World War, and people get these confused, and these are two separate things. So the first was a State Department operation. So right after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which, as you know, was a surprise. All of a sudden, we're at war, and then a couple of days later, the war with Japan, then Germany declares war against the United States. At that point, there were fully functioning German, Japanese, and Italian embassies in downtown Washington, D.C. on Massachusetts Avenue. So, and these are people who represent the country we're at war with. And there are American diplomats stranded in Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome. Right. So what are they going to do? Now remember, these are diplomats, so they're treated differently than normal people. And so really there wasn't any plan. But very quickly they said, first, we want to get the diplomats out of Washington for their safety. Also, there very possibly could have been intelligence gathering agents within the embassy. So they looked around, where can we take the diplomats? And while we work out the exchanges, somehow we're going to have to work out these. That was the goal, to exchange all these diplomats. So the Greenbrier's right on the railroad line, we're right down the road from Washington. A lot of people in Washington knew the Greenbrier, they're very familiar with it. It's isolated, easy to guard. Remember, you didn't want anything bad to happen. The primary concern in the State Department was the good treatment of the Americans overseas. Right. We treat the foreign diplomats well here, that'll ensure the good treatment of overseas. And so on December 19th, 1941, just a week or so after Pearl Harbor, trains pull up across the street with some German diplomats, and there were a few Hungarians and Bulgarians, and that begins what turns into a 7-month period when this little State Department talk, an internment center for enemy alien diplomats. Gotcha. So we closed. The State Department leased the Greenbrier. Paid the Greenbrier, actually $10 a day per person was the rate. It was the off season. Right. And it was January, February, and March. But the staff remained the same. They were treated as regular guests. And that was part of that. We want to treat these diplomats so well. And now it stretched on much longer. When the Greenbrier agreed to do this in December, they said, well, it'll be 2 or 3 months. And it extended all the way. The last diplomat didn't leave till the middle of July of 1942.
It must have been an interesting time for the staff here at the Greenbrier. You mentioned that they stayed on, you're used to treating guests well, but now you're treating
Y-
diplomats from a country that you're at war with.
Right, yeah. And when I got here, again, 40 odd years ago, there were people who had been here at that time. And, but, they had a sense of patriotism. They were doing something to help the government. The government had this problem, and they were doing something that would sort of help in its way, help the war effort, which was the sort of the prime concern at that point. So yeah, I think it was curious. It was curious, and I'm sure people were on their best behavior, because there were State Department people, there were FBI people here. The FBI people were trying to find if they could get some informants within. So it was a very delicate operation, very high level operation. Enemy alien diplomats in the midst of a war. I think it just sort of solidifies that relationship with Washington D.C.
Right. Well, what did they do while they were here? I mean, were the activities up and running? Were they able?
Well, of course, the big issue was could they play golf,
right.
And the answer was no. What they did was they went back and forth. So the Americans were held in an old hotel outside down in Bavaria. That actually had been closed for a couple of years. They had to bring in the stuff. Because remember, Germany had been at war since 1939, right. And there was rationing over there, and the Americans in Italy stayed right in Rome, and then apparently there was a compound in Tokyo where the Americans stayed in Japan. But anyway, the State Department would exchange what amenities are allowed to our diplomats over there. I don't think any of them were near golf courses. But I think, it turns out, it sounds great. What's 7 months at the Greenbrier can't be too bad. But, these were high-level people.
Right.
They were and it really boredom became an issue. And I think, particularly as it dragged on and on, they thought maybe they'd end up spending the whole war here,
Right.
In fact, right next to us, the room right next to us, there were ping pong tables. I've seen pictures of, played a lot of ping pong. Actually, what they did a lot of was shop.
Okay.
So the shops were in the same place as they are today. And then the story is told that they bought everything out of the shops because these were sophisticated people. Sure. If you were a member of the Foreign Service, you would spend a lot of time overseas. You were sophisticated people. And just our kind of patron for the shops here, right? And the story is they bought everything out, and then they finally went to Montgomery Ward catalogs, ordering things, and they get up in the morning. A big topic of conversation is what's new down in the shop, so we can go look at. So I think really, at one hand it sounds like glorious for being here for 7 months, but there was this tension. And the rumors going around, are we about to leave? But it just sort of went week to week to week. And I think it was because there was a war going on, and this whole process, nobody anticipated that it was going to last 7 months.
So did all of them leave at pretty much the same time, or were there sort of?
Well, let's see, the Japanese left, the two other hotels were involved, the Homestead and the Grove Park, the Homestead in Virginia and the Grove Park in North Carolina, and they actually shifted the diplomats around a little here. So it started out just Germans and Italians here, and the Japanese at the Homestead, and then the Italians went down to the Grove Park Inn, and the Japanese came over here. Actually, I guess the Japanese left earliest, and what they did, they had to arrange the transport. They went across. We got a train, went up to New York. Now the Japanese. They go to New York, they take a ship, they go down to Rio de Janeiro. There were more Japanese diplomats down there. And then they go to Mozambique on the East African coast, which was a neutral country. It was a Portuguese colony at the time, and that's where the exchange took place. So all these things, and the Germans, the last ones, I say, left in mid-July of 42. They went to Lisbon, Portugal. Again, Portugal was neutral. Right. And the State Department thinks about things like this, where they're actually gonna, the ship pulled up, the Americans got off, the Germans got off one end, and the Americans had taken a train from Bavaria, they got on the other, and they used a Swedish ship. Sweden was neutral too. Okay. So you see how sort of complicated these high-level diplomatic endeavors are.
Absolutely. So now we're to July of 1942, and the last group of diplomats leave. And obviously, anybody knows anything about the Greenbrier knows July is kind of the peak period.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how quickly then did the Greenbrier get back up and running?
Got up and running, but it only ran for 6 months, 6 weeks, not
Right.
6 weeks. Even before the last diplomats left, the Army was looking at this as a hospital. And the Navy wanted to use it as kind of an R&R. So as usual, the Army and the Navy were disagreeing on things. And apparently there was a board in Washington that said the Army needs a hospital more than the Navy needs an R&R center. Now again, when we get into World War II, we really weren't prepared for a war on that scale. And the first big invasion of the Second World War was the invasion of North Africa. So on November 1st, 1942, thousands of American troops go over and invade North Africa. Well, when you do that, you're going to generate casualties. So there was a tremendous pressure to vastly expand hospital capacity fast, right now. And so they were looking at all sorts of possibilities. So here you had a big building, again, accessible by rail right from Washington, D.C. So they came down here and started negotiating with the railroad. Remember, this is owned by the C&O Railway, and quite a few hotels were taken over. Like down in Florida, they did a lot of flight training, and the hotels became like dormitories, and several were turned into hospitals. This certainly wasn't the only one, but they got stuck on the term. They were the Army was going to lease it, and they went back and forth, and finally decided to actually sell it. So this actually was government property. The government bought this. There were deeds in the courthouse. Paid $3,300,000 for the Greenbrier, and back then 7,000 acres of land.
So during that short time that the Greenbrier did open back up, officials kind of knew at that point that it wasn't going to last long, right?
Right. Yeah, they could see something was going to happen. And speaking of officials, one of the interesting things the Army did was commission about half a dozen Greenbrier executives and make them lieutenants and captains, and that way, like the chief engineer. Colonel Patterson, well, he knew where all the pipes were, So he became an Army officer, and he became the chief engineer of Ashford General Hospital. So the policy in the Second World War was to name new Army hospitals after deceased Army physicians. Okay. So Ashford is a reference to a Dr. Bailey K. Ashford, who'd worked down in Puerto Rico in the Spanish-American War, had died in the early 30s. So that's who they were honoring, Dr. Ashford.
Gotcha. So it opened, what's the date that Ashford General officially opens?
Well, the sale takes place in September, early September. And I think September 1st, and there was a party out at the golf clubhouse, this is, because again, that's one of those moments. The Greenbrier was closing. It was being taken over. It was owned by the Army. Nobody knew where this war was going to go in September of 1942. It could have been the end of the Greenbrier. And now, the legal transaction, but it wasn't until about, say, November that they started actually bring soldiers down here. And this was a big process, converting this hotel into a hospital. And it's interesting, I've met one of the most interesting parts of my job over the years was I met people who were patients who had worked here. And particularly in those first few months, it was very Greenbrier-like. They were still serving tablecloths in the main dining room. As time goes on, it becomes more hospital-like as they work on it. And I remember talking to the man who was, in fact, in charge of converting this into a hospital. So it didn't take that long. And I told him I was amazed how fast they did it. And he said, well, the Army put a high priority on hospitals. So if you could get the workers and the material here, you could get it done. And the Army gave a high priority to that. So the hotel became the hospital. The guest rooms became the patients' wards. So it was a 2,000-bed hospital. This was a 500-room hotel at the time. So you and I can figure that's 4 beds per room.
Right.
And so they were packed in here. The main dining room became the mess hall. There are chandeliers in the main dining room today that were there in 1942. So it was a pretty nice mess hall. The officers lived in the cottages, and the higher your rank, the bigger the officers and the physicians. They brought in lots of nurses, and they did build some Quonset huts around here, because again, it took a big staff, and it was about half military and half local, so lots of people in White Sulphur.
They had to build some new elevator shafts as well, right?
In many ways, that was one of the biggest problems. Was this wasn't designed to get people up and down in wheelchairs and in stretchers and that sort of thing. So, in fact, just right across from the ballroom where we're sitting now, they had a great big. Actually, there were 3 elevators going up and down, and they never would have, because the elevators are the same today as they were back then. If you try to imagine trying to move all these people up and down, it never would have worked. So yeah, there was definitely a high priority on that, and so get everybody up and down to the floors. And then the operator, they did surgery. They did vascular surgery and neurosurgery, blood vessel and nerve surgery. Those were the 2 specialties. So a lot of the GIs who were here for those specialties. And they put those operating rooms up on the top of the hotel because they got the best natural sunlight up there. Okay. So these elevators were critical to and the other thing they had to do was increase the water supply. The Greenbrier has always owned its own water supply, going back to when the railroad first built the Greenbrier. But again, there were just 2,000 people. Back in the 30s, if we had 800 or 900 people here, that was considered a full house. And now we're 2,000 people. So they expanded the Springs operation up at Alvon Springs to supply all that. So the elevator and the water supply, I think, were the 2 major things they had to do to transform it into a hospital.
I guess one of the big benefits to troops as they were rehabilitating themselves here is we didn't allow the diplomats to play golf.
Yeah.
We did allow the troops.
Golf was considered physical therapy, Yeah, I remember this one guy saying, the doctor ordered me, Private Smith reporting for physical therapy, down here at the golf club. And of course, lots of doctors, that's the other thing. I think a lot of doctors got in a lot of golf while they were here. But that was, this was a health resort before that. So the mineral springs, the spa was in use. The indoor swimming pool was heavily used, golf and tennis. And you were very much encouraged. You were encouraged to use the hiking trails. So it was a combination of surgical and rehabilitation. As I say, I've met a number of the soldiers, and what always struck me was how long they were here. I mean, 5, 6, 7 months. I met one guy who was here 2 years, And so the idea was you had surgery or whatever procedures you needed, and you were here until you're ready to go either back on active service or be medically discharged. So as I said, it was many, many months, and I've always, it's funny. I've had a soft spot in my heart. My father was in an Army hospital out in Hawaii in the Second World War, so I always had a soft spot in my heart for this whole story, and really one of the highlights of my years here was meeting these guys who came back after 20 or 30 years. And one of the interesting things I always, in most cases, I had this conversation dozens of times. They'd come back with their family, and the family members would say, Dad or Grandpa or my husband, they've been talking for years. He's been talking about this great Army hospital they were in, and it had been this fancy resort, and then it was called Ashford General, and they would say, well, let's go back there. And I'd say, no, and they were very hesitant because I guess it was a bittersweet experience. I mean, most of them left in better condition than they arrived, but still, it was a hospital, and you saw the ravages of war. But my point is, the family had to sort of drag them back. Right. But once they were here, it was terrific because really, the mountains are the same. To a large degree, the building looks the same from the outside. You got the cottages, you got the golf clubhouse. The decor is all different. Right. But to a large degree, they could very much feel that they're back in Ashford General Hospital.
That's amazing. Going back to what you were talking about the exercise and the rehabilitation, my son was actually doing a social studies project last year on the role that sports have played in keeping the Greenbrier alive through the years. And we came across a picture of a gym that they actually had on property during those days.
Yeah, where the outdoor pool is today. Okay. And that was one of the Army didn't really build that many things. They used what was here. Actually, the last thing that's still here is the fire station. Okay. So the fire station that we use today was built by the Army in 1943. But they built a big gym right on the same side as the outdoor pool. And basketball, they had dances in there. And they didn't, it was a well-built, in fact, after the war was over, they actually dismantled it and took this gym, and took it to Beckley. Oh, wow. And the people in Beckley used it for 20 or 30 years. It's not there anymore, but they used good quality materials, and they learned, took it apart, and it served the people of Beckley for 20, 25 years afterwards.
Wow, that's amazing. And talking about the diplomats, we talked about the retail corridor being such a popular spot for them. What was that used for during the Ashford General?
Well, there was a commissary, and a PX, but there were a lot of laboratories along there too. So they did some lab work. Sort of all along one side was all the lab work, and then there was a PX. You could get magazines. There was a soda fountain. You go down there and get Coca-Colas. I think they did serve beer. They did serve beer, and so that was sort of complemented. Most of the meals would have been served in the main dining room, and there were lots of visitors. Again, since the GIs were here for so long, their wives, their family would come and visit, and for the people of White Sulphur, it was part of their sort of patriotic duty was helping the families, opening their homes. Lots of people in town opened their homes, rented out rooms for people visiting the soldiers here at Ashford General.
And I know it was during that time that you've told me that you've met some people over the course of your career that were actually born here during that time as well.
Yeah. You get boys, you get girls, you get babies, and most of them were staff people, some of the officers here who had been here for several years. Right. The chief of surgery came from Emory University down in Atlanta, and he hired a bunch of his friends to come down here to make it the surgical center. And so I met people who lived in the Baltimore cottages, were here for 3 or 4 years, had a couple of kids. So so the old president, not the current presidential suite, the one we call the congressional suite today, that was the maternity ward. So yeah, I met a number of people. Or there were a couple of cases where the wife came down to visit her husband and the baby came early. There were cases where maybe there was locally a difficult delivery, and so they came to use the physicians here. So I don't have a number, but I probably met 20 people who were born at the Greenbrier during the Second World War.
And the number of troops who were treated here is staggering as well.
I never really knew the number. Years ago, I went up to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and they really don't have that big of a collection, but that's where I came across it. 24,148 soldiers was the official number of soldiers who were admitted here over a 4-year period. So it was a busy, busy place. And and 4 beds per room, they were packed in here, and they talk about wheelchair races up and down from here down to the golf club. As you can imagine, you could get honking. It's downhill to that golf club. You can imagine wheelchairs zooming on down there. These were all young guys. They were pretty energetic, and they were doing the best they could. Of course, and I think one of the complaints was they're out in the woods here,
Right.
And there wasn't much action around here. But that was the whole idea, to concentrate on getting better.
Sure. Well, the project eventually comes to an end when the war comes to an end, and that kind of leads to the Dorothy Draper story, which is probably another episode of the Fire Chat podcast here. But just take us through how it ended, and that, as you said, that could have been the end of the Greenbrier, but it wasn't, right?
So the war ends, and the Japanese surrender in September of '45, and so it had been almost exactly 4 years that it had been the Army hospital, And it was actually a big process to close this down. It took about a year to move everything to other bases, and reassign people and reassign patients. So it didn't really end until 1946 when the last soldiers left. But remember, it was a sad. This is one of those. the ball could have bounced. The Army could have kept it.
Right.
The Army could have kept it and turned it into a big VA hospital, or anything else for that matter. And so there was no agreement that the railroad would buy it back. In fact, there were some members of the board of directors who were trying to unload the Greenbrier. But the chairman of the board, Robert R. Young, wanted it back. So he was the largest investor, and he made it happen. But again, that's one of those moments that, it's sort of interesting. I'm talking to the Gillespie family that do the flowers here. For 100 years, they've been doing the flowers here. And Ken, the man who started it, I remember him saying that there was actually a gambling syndicate was expressing interest.
Really?
Back in the late 40s, and people were horrified. Gambling at the Greenbrier, oh my God, this is terrible. It's kind of funny, given that, years later we'll build a casino here. But so I guess other people were looking at it, but Mr. Young made it happen, and then he's the one who hires Dorothy Draper.
I guess one thing we probably should have mentioned as well, and this leads into a future Prior Chat podcast episode as well, but the way history connects and things are all tied together. That's when Eisenhower first visited, right? Was during the hospital days.
Right. Yes, Eisenhower. And really, I've always thought, particularly, he was here 3 times. Once he was a patient; he had bronchitis. But early in the war, early in 1944, January 44, he made sort of a secret trip back to the U.S. And they were still making the final plans on the D-Day. And this is when Eisenhower was told that you're going to be the Supreme Allied Commander, as opposed to General George Marshall, who was the other candidate. And so Eisenhower came back, he visited his mother, and he spent a couple of days up in Top Notch Cottage up here with Mamie, with Mrs. Eisenhower. But the one that's always struck in my mind is that this is where he came when the war ended. So when the Germans surrendered there in the first week of May of 1945, he wants to come home. He wants to spend, again, he's only seen Mrs. Eisenhower once in 4 years, And so they spent a couple of weeks here. And, it's sort of an interesting moment. Here's the guy, the Supreme, that's a great title, right? The Supreme Allied Commander. And he just wants a little quiet time. He wants to go fishing. He wants to play golf. Incidentally, when I say I met people over the years, if they had the slightest encounter with General Eisenhower, if the elevator opened and they saw him, that's the first thing they taught. I saw General Eisenhower here. And in fact, I met a guy once who took Eisenhower fishing. Eisenhower wanted to go fishing. And this guy was an enlisted man, but he was from Michigan. He was an outdoorsman. And Eisenhower just wanted to go fishing. And this guy was pretty good at this, so they went on Howard's Creek down here. And I remember the story was, he realized as soon as he got there, really what he was there to do was sit and listen to Eisenhower talk.
Right.
And he said, you wouldn't believe what Eisenhower told me, especially about the other generals. And I said,
right.
I don't let. And 50 years later, he wouldn't repeat what Eisenhower. They were sitting. I always pictured them sitting by the banks, and Eisenhower just talking about what his opinion of various officers, and this guy kept his mouth shut 50 years later.
Well, that'll work into a future episode. We'll definitely get you on to talk about Eisenhower and his relationship to the bunker that was built on property. We'll definitely get into that. But I think this was a great conversation, and enjoyed having you on to talk about this critical moment in the Greenbrier's history in World War II.
Looking forward to another conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us.
Right.
Hope we covered all your questions here on the Briar Chat podcast about the Greenbrier's role during World War II. Let us know what you think. Get on and comment on Facebook or YouTube. Let us know what you think of the podcast. Let us know what questions you might have. We might have a Q&A podcast coming up at some point if we get enough questions. And let us know maybe some topics you'd like to see covered in future editions. But we appreciate you joining us. Come visit us at the Greenbrier. And thanks for joining us. See you again next time on the Greenbrier Briar Chat podcast.